Good morning. Welcome to another edition of Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Yesterday, we concluded with a discussion about the narrative included in this current book that we're reading, The Global Vatican, of former U.S. Ambassador to the Holy See, Francis Rooney's initial trip to the Vatican and how he was prepared by the American State Department and the President of the United States, President George W. Bush. And I'm particularly stunned by the language used in these initial official instructions from President George W. Bush. We're at the bottom of page 153, if you're following along in your own copy of the book. I'll begin with the beginning of the paragraph where we concluded yesterday. He says, a few days after the swearing in, this is the swearing in ceremony of Francis Rooney's new ambassadorship. He says, a few days after the swearing in, a package arrived at my office in Tulsa. Inside were my official instructions from President Bush, and I will add, you can imagine he probably had plenty of unofficial instructions as well, since there was such a cozy relationship between the Bush administration and the papacy, the Antichrist of the Bible. He continues, he says, the letter outlined the duties of an ambassador of the United States in the year 2005. Okay, these are the official duties as ambassador to the Holy See in the year 2005. It begins with a brief statement. It says, our commitment to freedom is America's tradition. The advance of freedom is also the surest way to undermine terror and tyranny and to promote peace and prosperity. Your task is to help in advancing this great cause by, number one, waging a relentless global war to defeat those who seek to harm us and our friends. Number two, overcoming the faceless enemies of human dignity, including disease, starvation, and poverty. And number three, assisting American citizens, institutions, and businesses as they pursue their charitable and commercial interests. Now, I would like to make a few comments. First of all, Ambassador Rooney was instructed by the very first article here that the United States was committed to a relentless global war. And it has, we've got 10 years of history, and the United States is pursuing a global war. No doubt about it. And it says the purpose of this global, relentless war is to defeat those who seek to harm us and our friends. As defined by whom, I would ask? And for what purpose? Obviously, Francis Rooney is going to have some basic understandings without having all the terms described to him in a piece of paper that might be read by someone other than he. But the United States government serves the papacy. That's what this whole book is about. So when he says to seek to defeat those who seek to harm us and our friends, might that include those who the papacy might regard as its enemies, such as Protestants who believe that the papacy is the Antichrist of the Bible? I see this as an opening for Protestant persecution in this country. governmental persecution of Bible-believing Christians seeking to educate others about the historical and prophetic Antichrist of the Bible. These aren't just common, everyday, ordinary instructions. These have specific meanings. These words, while looked upon by those who are unaware of the relationship between the United States and the Holy See, might see no harm whatsoever in these words. But if you know what the Vatican's agenda in the world is, and what the United States is, what its prophetic role is in relation to the first beast of Revelation chapter 13, that which rose up out of the sea, that being the papacy, then these words have distinctly different meanings than what the ordinary eye would perceive. Now, I'm not trying to read anything into this. We've already seen what this relentless war entails. It started with the destruction of over 3,000 Americans who were working in the Twin Towers. Yes, I believe the United States government was directly responsible for 9/11. And that being the case, and not just mere speculation, the United States government made war upon the citizenry of the United States in order to justify a war against who knows whom. Certainly, it's now admitted by our government. It was admitted by George W. Bush even before he left office. Saddam Hussein had no weapons of mass destruction and had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11. But they're pursuing a relentless global war. And how did they get the American people to submit to the idea of a perpetual, relentless global war? Well, the greatest terror attack in this country's history. Unless, of course, you think the first Pearl Harbor was the worst terrorist attack. And by the way, those who are rolling their eyes, it's now official. Classified government documents now reveal that President Roosevelt knew beforehand about the attack on Pearl Harbor. And as a matter of fact, the think tank that was responsible for contriving a means through which to achieve a global American empire, a new world order, admitted that lacking some catastrophic event equivalent to Pearl Harbor, the United States would be, well, lacking motivation to go on a global crusade to establish this new world order. And 9/11 was that new Pearl Harbor. The Project for the New American Century. Just look it up. Project for a New American Century, PNAC. To those who are in this research, and I'm not the only one by any stretch of the imagination, they already know this stuff. It's the American people who are unwilling to look into it because it spells bad news for America and Americans. Our government is pursuing a global empire for someone else. And that someone else is the papacy. Now, with that understanding, as brief as it is, and as incomplete as it is, listen to the words again. waging a relentless global war to defeat those who seek to harm us and our friends. Does it still sound relatively harmless to you? The second item is overcoming the faceless enemies of human dignity. Where have we heard that word before? Human dignity. All throughout this book, the papacy keeps talking about human dignity. That it is the great champion, that the papacy or the Holy See is the great champion of human dignity. Is that why our government, with such concern for human dignity, made war against its own citizenry on 9/11? What kind of human dignity is that? All this public concern for human dignity, including disease, starvation, and poverty. We're going to be concerned about disease, starvation, and poverty. Is that why the border with Mexico, Roman Catholic Mexico, is open to the United States? Is that how our government is fighting disease, starvation, and poverty? Making us all paupers to support Roman Catholic Mexicans, Roman Catholic Central and South Americans? Oh, I know. It's all about cheap labor, right? It's not about cheap labor. That's just cover. This is a religious war for the papacy. And opening the southern border with Roman Catholic Mexico is a way to help Catholicize the United States of America. After all, the Protestants no longer protest, and you don't see any Protestants protesting the Roman Catholics who are coming to this country. No, they call it, they call them all, what do they call them? Illegal immigrants? Have you ever heard that before 9/11? Have you ever heard the term illegal immigrant before? Does it ever make sense when you say it with your own mouth? Illegal immigrant? You know what illegal immigration is in other countries besides the United States? It's an invasion. Okay? See how they disarm your mind by just simply calling it by another name? It's a Roman Catholic invasion of this country. Every Roman Catholic has an equal right and an equal power in the voting booth and in civilization. So if you can open the borders and immigrate legally or illegally Roman Catholics, then the country becomes more Roman Catholic, doesn't it? Just like it did back in the 1800s with the flood of European and Irish Roman Catholics to this country, which most of the authors that we read here on Inquisition Update warned the American people that the American government was opening the gates of this country to Roman Catholics. You know, that greatest of all evils to be feared in a nation. And that through that mass immigration, the papacy just got the Bible out of the schools. Now you say, wait a minute, Tom, the papacy, the Roman Catholic Church got the Bible out of the schools? Do you know anything about history? Do you know anything about Protestant history? The greatest enemy of the Bible, the sworn enemy of the Bible, is the papacy, because the Bible reveals the papacy as the Antichrist. The Bible reveals God's will for man. And it runs directly counter to what the Pope's will is for man. And that's why the papacy made handling the Bible, much less reading it, by average, everyday human beings illegal, with the threat of excommunication, with the threat of being labeled a heretic, because the papacy knew that if people read the Bible, they would understand it. and marked the papacy as the Antichrist. And so the Bible was forbidden to be printed in the language that the people could understand. It had to be in Latin. And it couldn't be translated or printed by anyone other than the Roman Catholic Church. Nor could it be taught by anyone other than a priest of the Roman Catholic Church. And even that teaching had to submit completely to the official teaching of the papacy. And that's how they kept the truth. They kept the world in darkness. That's why they call it the Dark Ages. And they burned Bibles that were found in the hands of the people. They rounded up all the Bibles and burned them publicly. And when that didn't stifle the Word of God, they burnt the Bibles and those who read them, calling them heretics. Is that concern for human dignity that the papacy so champions? Does the papacy still hate the Bible, God's holy Word? Is that why there are so many perverted Bibles now available in the bookstores? As a matter of fact, most bookstores, you have to special order a King James Bible because they don't have them. They don't stock them. Suppression of the truth. Human dignity. The papacy is all about human dignity. But he doesn't want us to know about Jesus. And he most certainly doesn't want us to know about who is the Antichrist in this world. The third point, assisting American citizens, institutions, and businesses as they pursue their charitable and commercial interests. I don't have much comment about that, but I don't see that as the real purpose of an ambassadorship between the presidency of the United States and the Holy See. And it was an ambassadorship to President George W. Bush and not the American people, because I wasn't represented by that ambassador. My wisdom and understanding wasn't even comprehended by that ambassador. And nor was I represented to the man of sin through this ambassador. They've run off with our country. They've run off with our country, and the American people are completely oblivious to it as a whole. As a people, we have no idea the crimes committed against us by our own government. Anyway, I'll continue with the reading. He says, not long thereafter, instructions in hand, Kathleen and I were on a plane to Rome. I began this book with a description of the credentialing day, the climax of which was a private meeting with Benedict XVI in his library. After those first moments when nerves briefly froze my tongue, I began to speak about the areas in which I hoped the Holy See in the United States could cooperate successfully. I had been given a series of topics to discuss in our meeting. Those ranged from human trafficking to immigration, to religious freedom, all concerns in which the United States and the Holy See shared parallel interests and goals. I would love to comment about this if you'll permit me. The papacy expresses continually its concern for human trafficking. But who historically is the most prolific trafficker in the souls of men in world history? The papacy. The great slavers of the world were the Jesuits. We've talked many times about the Paraguayan reductions, where the Jesuits enslaved the Indians of Paraguay in a communistic sort of society, where they provided the necessities of life and enslaved them and took their goods and marketed them in Europe for their own benefit, not for the benefit of the Guaranis. What about Christopher Columbus? Historically, Christopher Columbus came to the Western Hemisphere at the behest of Pope Alexander VI, arguably the most wicked pope in world history. And his purpose was to Catholicize all of the natives. And so he baptized them. And if they wouldn't submit to baptism, he simply burned them. That's why they celebrate Columbus Day. They call that a victory for the church, for the Roman Catholic Church. What about the priest-pedophile pandemic in the world? Where do you suppose they get all the little boys to satisfy all these sodomite and pedophilic priests? You know, if the papacy expresses so much concern about human trafficking, they ought to be experts in the subject too, especially when they're responsible for most of the human trafficking in this world. When we talk about human trafficking, we usually think of prostitution and illicit sexual behavior and content, and that people are literally taken off the streets to become sexual slaves for their degenerate masters. But it's the very priests themselves that devour this information and these people. And not just in modern times. This has been a fixture among the priesthood of the Roman Catholic Church throughout its history. And yet when the world sees the papacy stand up before the cameras and the microphones and seeming to be all about human dignity and against trafficking of human beings, you're looking at the greatest trafficker of human flesh in world history. And what about immigration? The papacy's so concerned about immigration. It knows more about immigration and the mass movement of people than any other institution in the world. After all, it learned during the Crusades. It learned how to dislocate people and then to use those people who are strangers in a new land. It knows how to flood a nation with people of the Roman Catholic faith in order to gain control of the government, such is the case of the United States itself. Currently, there's all kinds of concern in Germany and in Europe of people fleeing from Syria, from the war in Syria. This is a mass location of human beings for a purpose: to literally destroy the nationhood of every nation. If you're going to create a global government, you must first do something to diminish the patriotic loyalty that people have for their own geographical bounds. You must erase borders and get people more and more gradually and ever more surely recognize the world as a global village. And that the patriotism should move from their local government to the global government. And you break down those patriotic ties by breaking down the borders of the nations, and you do that by the mass migration, forced migration of human people. That's human trafficking on a global scale. Moving people about for a selfish purpose. More when we get back from the break. You're listening to Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio.
years ahead of the dominant media. FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net. The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening. Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host Melody Cedarstrom right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free 1-800-375-4188.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. If you'd like to support Inquisition Update, please support First Amendment Radio, who sponsors the program. And if you'd like to contact me, please do so by email. My email address is tom@seawaves.us. Now, we're picking up where we left off before the break. He says, I had been given a series of topics to discuss in our meeting. These ranged from human trafficking, we dealt with that one briefly, very briefly. Immigration, ever so briefly, we dealt with that. And religious freedom. Let's talk about religious freedom for a moment. What have we learned from all the authors that we've read here on Inquisition Update, or the lion's share of them? The definition of religious freedom to a papist, to the popes, and to devout Roman Catholics. Religious freedom means freedom to be Catholic. Freedom to take over the education system in order to make everyone else, whether they know it or not, Roman Catholic. Freedom to teach children Roman Catholic doctrine in the schools. Religious freedom to a papist means freedom to practice Roman Catholicism without opposition. No protest. Religious freedom to a Roman Catholic, to the papacy, is to make everyone Roman Catholic either through forced conversion or through the passage of Roman Catholic canon law through the civil law. At the very least, to make the civil laws of every land conform to Roman Catholicism, to conform to Roman Catholic canon law. And again, I mentioned this before, one of the most valuable videos available for this subject is one by Richard Bennett, a former Roman Catholic priest who well understands the system Rome uses to Catholicize every nation. His video is entitled Papal Vatican Control. I'll get it right eventually. Vatican Control through Civil Law. Vatican Control through Civil Law. You can go to Richard Bennett's website, www.bereanbeacon.org. BEREANBEACON.org. Berean Beacon. Or just Google his name, Richard Bennett, 2 N's and 2 T's, Richard Bennett, and go to his website, scroll down through the list of invaluable videos that he has launched, and find the one, Vatican Control through Civil Law, and listen to it come straight from a former Roman Catholic priest's lips. You just think you're Protestant. You call yourself a Protestant. You may even protest the papacy, unlike most Protestants today. But the laws of the land conform to Roman Catholic canon law. They make you Catholic without you even knowing it. That's what religious freedom is from the eyes of the papacy and from the eyes of the kings of the world who serve him. Is that okay with you? See, you've been given an entirely different view of what religious freedom is. But it has nothing whatsoever to do with facts on the ground reality. Roman Catholicism through the civil law. Vatican control through civil law. Watch that video. It's an eye-opener. All right, we discussed human trafficking, immigration, religious freedom, all concerns in which the United States and the Holy See shared parallel interests and goals. Goals. The United States government shares goals with the Holy See. And the major one of which is a global empire for the papacy. Is that okay with you? That your tax dollars be used to achieve a papal goal? An antichrist goal for a global government? Now he says, though our mutual principles remain fundamentally the same as they had been when William Wilson sat down with Pope John Paul II, much in the world had changed since 1984. The Cold War was over, and the United States was now engaged in a new high-stakes struggle against terrorist organizations. As the President's instructions indicated, the global war on terror would be the focus during much of my tenure in Rome. The Holy See was as concerned as we Americans were about terrorism. But if we agreed on the threat, we did not entirely agree on how to deal with it. John Paul II's Vatican had vigorously protested America's invasion of Iraq in 2003. Let me just stop you right there. You think the American military would have been allowed, being it's so close with the papacy, do you think it would have been allowed by the Pope to attack Iraq in 2003 without the Pope's secret blessing? Well, I ran out of bridges a long time ago, but I'd sell you a bridge on the moon if I had one, if you believe that one. John Paul II was all about the global New World Order. The Vatican's eventual throne is intended to be Jerusalem. There are assets in the Middle East that need to be in the control of the papacy through the United States government. the radical fundamentalist Muslims who are such a great threat to Christianity must be silenced. And that's why we went. For it was a global objective of the papacy. And was just covered up under the disguise of terror. The United States achieves its goals by demonizing other people, conducting false flag operations, and blaming it on other people to justify crusades. And the American people need to know about it. But John Paul II, you can bet your bippy, was behind the war in Iraq. Both of them. Conducted by George H.W. Bush, a Knight of Malta, a sworn oath-spitting warrior for the Pope, and George W. Bush, a skull and bonesman, just one of the knighthoods that served the Jesuit order. All right, he says, the Holy See was as concerned as we Americans were about terrorism, but if we agreed on the threat, we did not entirely agree on how to deal with it. John Paul II's Vatican had vigorously protested America's invasion of Iraq in 2003. You know, part of the reason why we went to Iraq, Roman Catholics in Iraq were persecuted. And of course, it didn't come that way in the papers. It talked about Christian persecution. Persecution against Christians. See, the whole world believes Roman Catholicism is Christian. He says Cardinal Pio Laghi, the former nuncio to the United States, had been dispatched on a special papal mission to Washington, where he met with President Bush to deliver the Pope's message opposing the intervention in Iraq. My immediate predecessor, Ambassador Jim Nicholson, engaged in a series of intense disagreements with various elements of the Holy See on account of the war. Now, 3 years into the conflict, sitting before the new Pope, I was prepared to defend our actions in Iraq, what we were trying to accomplish there, and what success would mean for the same, or rather for the cause of freedom in the world. I was surprised then by the Pope's response when I raised the issue. He waved his hand with a gentle, sweeping motion and said this, quote, "Let us speak no more of Iraq," unquote. He said, quote, "Iraq is past history. Let's talk of the future," unquote. Now, were the papacy really against the war in Iraq? There would have been excommunications all around, wouldn't there? There would have been religious censures all around, wouldn't there? No such thing. The Pope just waved his hand. That's history. Let's just move on. Let's speak no more of Iraq. Let's talk about the future. And the world just can't comprehend. He says the Vatican had spoken with conviction against the war, but the war was 3 years old. The Pope intended to focus the Vatican's energies now on ways to work constructively to bring stability and reduce conflict in the country. What do you suppose stability means to the papacy for the Middle East? I've already explained it. The Vatican was deeply engaged and informed on all aspects of Islamic fundamentalism. Indeed, the dynamic between the Christian West and the Muslim East had been occupying the Holy See since the Crusades, when the Church's commitment to peace and to understanding other religions was not quite as evolved as it later became. Mentioning the Crusades. And that's what they are today as well. Crusades. They are all about advancing the papacy's control advancing and increasing the papacy's power. And it's now Protestants who enlist in the armies to fight those papal proxy wars, those crusades for the Pope. He says, increasingly, an early occurrence of schism between the Shiite Muslim and the Sunni Muslim sects benefited the Holy See during the First Crusade of 1099, when Christian warriors tried to take Jerusalem from the Fatimid Shiites of Egypt. Why was the Vatican concerned about controlling Jerusalem during the time of the Crusades? I won't even bother to try to answer that question, but I want to ask you, do you suppose it might be the same desire the papacy has for Jerusalem today? That he might place his throne upon the very hill where Abraham posed to sacrifice Isaac, on that very hill upon which Jesus preached. That's the goal of the Vatican. Jerusalem is the apple of the papacy's eye. The greatest Zionist in all the world is the papacy. That city, from his point of view, is for him, under the name of Christ's Vicar, when in fact he's the Antichrist of the Bible. And they took advantage of a disagreement between the Shiites and the Sunni Muslims, and were able to capture Jerusalem. See how they pit their enemies against one another and defeat them there likewise? No one has more experience in the theory of divide and conquer than does the papacy. No one has more experience in how to wage a war than the Crusader in Rome. He says the Crusaders were successful because the rival Seljuk Turks, Sunnis from Aleppo, refused to go help their fellow Muslims in Jerusalem. Absent this rivalry, the Christians might never have taken Jerusalem and held it for 88 years until Saladin and a more cohesive and united Muslim force took it back in 1187, defeating a Christian coalition that sank into its own internal rivalries. You see, they still talk about the Crusades and the concern over Jerusalem. Might that still be the concern today? What is the papacy's desire for Jerusalem? It's going to be the seat of his global government. Satan, through his vicar, the papacy, would like nothing more than to sit upon that mountain and be worshipped by all humanity as the God of gods. And I'm reminded of the offer that Satan made Jesus 2,000 years ago. See all the kingdoms in the world and the glory of them? All of that I will give you if you'll just bow down and worship me. Jesus refused that offer. Guess who accepted it? You're going to see Bible prophecy fulfilled probably in your lifetime in Jerusalem. But it won't be the Christ, Jesus Christ, seated on that hill. It'll be the Antichrist. And the whole world is going to worship him, either willingly or by force. It says, Christians might never have taken Jerusalem and held it for 88 years until Saladin and a more cohesive and united Muslim force would take it back in 1187, defeating a Christian coalition that sank into its own internal rivalries. Pope Benedict himself had thought a great deal about the question of Islam, both as Pope and in his earlier life as a scholar. Quote, "You know, there are two Mohammeds," he said to me now as we sat in the library. Quote, "the Muhammad of the early Quran, who is tolerant, and the Muhammad of the later Quran, who is aggressive," unquote. This was a distinction he would come back to again in public, most dramatically and controversially in a speech the following year in Regensburg, Germany. Remember that speech? Benedict XVI made some comment about critical of Islam, that they proselytized at the point of a sword. And the Muslims were furious. Terror unleashed all over the world as a reaction to the Pope's comments. And the Pope eventually made a trip to the Middle East, to Muslim territory, and even worshipped in a mosque. Took off his little yellow-red slippers and got on his knees and worshipped Allah. And by the way, while he was there, he signed documents with the Eastern Orthodox Church, an ecumenical capitulation to the man of sin. And when he left the cathedral, after having had the Eastern Church signed over to him, they hailed him, "Papa, Papa," which would be unheard of by an Eastern Orthodox Catholic. So we know what happened at Regensburg and what came out of it. He says, "Looking back, I realized I was seeing a preview of Regensburg and an important glimpse into the new Pope's worldview." The Pope's concerns were hardly limited to the Muslim world. He also spoke at some length about the troubling trends of relativism and secularism sweeping into Western culture. The church was bigger than ever, but its growth was in the third world, and especially in Africa. Although Benedict did not make the connection explicitly at the time, the two major threats were conjoined in his mind. On the one hand, religious fundamentalism growing in the East. On the other hand, faith collapsing in the West. He believed he had a special role in mediating between these fundamentally opposed worldviews. Can you see the global religion taking place? He says, over the 8 years he served as Pope, Benedict XVI critics tended to categorize him as a kind of Manichaean fundamentalist, but that was a simplistic and flawed reading of the man. Certainly he took seriously the Church's obligation to clarify and defend the articles of the Catholic faith, but Benedict also demonstrated strong support for the clear separation of church and state. Jeez. Again, I'm fresh out of bridges. He took seriously the Church's obligation to clarify and defend the articles of the Catholic faith, but Benedict also demonstrated strong support for the clear separation of church and state, providing, of course, that the state made due accommodation for the free practice of religion. As noted earlier, Benedict was a great admirer of our First Amendment, quote, where the church itself becomes the state, freedom becomes lost, unquote, he once wrote. Quoting further, it says, but also when the church is done away with as a public and publicly relevant authority, then too freedom is extinguished, because there the state once again claims completely for itself the justification of morality, unquote. Listen, if you can cut through all the malarkey here, the only system that works for the papacy, the only one that the Bible even describes, is where the papacy rules over the kings of the earth. That's the New World Order. That was the old world order, and it's going to be the New World Order. And when the Pope tells you words contrary to this, you know he's lying. Either that or Jesus is. The Bible plainly tells us he reigneth over the kings of the earth. And if you say the President of the United States is an exception to that, you don't believe your Bible. And you certainly have been blinded to history. He says his words are worth considering, especially at a time when an alternative, more restrictive interpretation of the religious freedom language in the amendment is being advanced in the United States. Benedict once noted that his childhood in Germany during the Nazi reign stood as a lifelong example to him of what happens when nations expel God and worship only themselves and their leaders. Quote, politics must be a striving for justice, unquote, he declared to the German Bundestag on September 22, 2011, quoting St. Augustine, quote, without justice, what else is the state but a great band of robbers, unquote. You know, the greatest robber in all the world is the one who seeks to sit in God's throne. The one who seeks to usurp God's authority. The one who seeks to usurp God's title. That's the papacy. And how can this church be listened to by the world on the subject of justice? He said, without justice, what else is the state but a great band of robbers? In other words, if a state wants to justify its robbery of the people, all it has to do is submit to the papacy. Then that robbery is just in the papacy's mind. Linking belief in God to the concept of human rights, Benedict argued that faith is a fundamental precondition of human decency. Quote, the conviction that there is a creator God is what gave rise to the idea of human rights, the idea of the equality of all people before the law, the recognition of the inviolability of human dignity in every single person, and the awareness of the people's responsibility for their actions, unquote. See, this is how he deceives the whole world. Speaks one way with his mouth, but his fruits expose who he is. It says these concepts resonate with the founding principles of the United States as stated in the Declaration of Independence and the preamble to the Constitution, and have been expressed by popes and moral leaders for centuries. If you believe that garbage, all you have to do is read Pope Pius IX's encyclical and syllabus of error of 1864, where he damned virtually every tenet of this republic. Damned its Constitution and its preamble and its Bill of Rights. You see how Rome gets by with murder? I hope we've opened some eyes this morning. We'll continue on the program tomorrow. The book again is entitled The Global Vatican by former U.S. Ambassador to the Holy See, Francis Rooney. I highly recommend the book. Get it. And we'll continue our reading tomorrow on Inquisition Update. Thanks for listening.